Good morning, everybody, and thanks again for joining us in our Survive and Thrive series, brought to you by the Hunter Business Chamber. I'm Bob Hawes, the CEO of the Business Chamber, and on behalf of the board and everyone here, welcome again. While this event is being delivered across multiple locations, I would like to acknowledge the Hunter Business Chamber operates on the traditional lands of the Awabakal and Warramai people, and I pay respect to elders past, present and emerging. I also extend a warm welcome to any Indigenous people who are joining us today, and also recognise that Reconciliation Week commences today, and encourage everybody to seek out and participate in activities for that over the next week. Today, ladies and gentlemen, we are very privileged to have one of Australia's most prominent corporate leaders, Telstra CEO Andy Penn, who will speak about Telstra's response to the coronavirus, both as an employer and as an essential service provider. Andy has some interesting thoughts on how we should seize the opportunities arising from COVID-19 and the crisis to make lasting economic and societal changes. So we look forward to hearing his views on post-pandemic reform. Welcome, Andy, and thanks for joining us today. We also have Amy Delore from the Hunter Business Chamber, who will assist me in the discussion today, particularly in the Q&A session. And once again, ladies and gentlemen, encourage you, if anyone does have issues they can put through on the chat, we will seek to address those through the course of the event. I'd also like to acknowledge Clayton McSeveny, Telstra's General Manager in New South Wales North, sorry about that, Clayton, who has helped to set up this event. And Clayton's been a great supporter of the Chamber, and we know that Telstra has a strong interest and strong market up here in the Hunter, and we look forward to their continued support. Before we go to the main part of today's webinar, however, I would also like to acknowledge our sponsor for the Survive and Thrive series, the Newcastle Permanent.
When things change unexpectedly, we adapt. When things get complicated, we adapt. When we need to do things differently, we adapt. At Newcastle Permanent, we're adapting too, by increasing our Hunter-based call centre team to assist you and help give you some financial peace of mind. Because if one thing's certain in these uncertain times, we're here for you, and we're here for good.
The success and well-being of our customers, our people and our community has always been our driving purpose. As we all work together to manage the impacts of the pandemic for our families and our communities, that commitment remains strong. In recent weeks, our customers have changed their preferences in how they want to do their banking. We have adapted our services to meet this change and provide safe and easy ways for you to bank. We have enhanced our digital banking offering so you can do more online conveniently from wherever you are. Our Hunter-based customer contact centre team has been increased and is available to support you over the phone. Our branch network, the largest in the Hunter region, remains open for business. Our specialist home lenders, personal lenders and financial planners are available, including over the phone. Through this period, whatever challenges it may bring, we will adapt and we will remain true to our purpose. Newcastle Permanent will be here for you and here for good, as we always have for 117 years.
Thanks to Bernadette and thanks to the Perm for their support for this series. We'll now move into the discussion today, and feel free, ladies and gentlemen, to leave your videos on, but if you are going to move around, please turn off the video so no one is distracted. And as always, as I said, the Q&A session running throughout the event. And if you have questions you'd like to pose to Andy, please use the chat or to post any comments in relation to the session. So, Andy, to begin with, tell us a little about your initial response to COVID-19, both personally and as the CEO of a major organisation. How were you affected, and how quickly did you realise what the magnitude of this crisis that we're now in?
No, look, thanks very much, Bob, and thanks for the opportunity to join you all today. And I'll apologise in advance, as you say, we're all at home, so I've got my two dogs with me here at the moment. My wife's out doing she's doing some other things, so if the doorbell goes, they will go crazy, so I'll apologise for those things in advance. But look, no, it's great to be with you. Sorry I can't be in the Hunter Valley personally. I was pleased to be there obviously last year, catching up with key stakeholders locally. But as you say, I mean, obviously COVID's been, an incredible, unprecedented event. I mean, I've been in business for 42 years, and so it's certainly the most significant event I've ever personally experienced. And I think one of the unique things about it is that unlike most crises, and Telstra's pretty used to dealing with crises because we'd barely come out of the bushfires, and having our crisis management team set up before COVID was upon us. But one of the unusual things about COVID is that it impacts us all personally. And so as leaders, we're dealing with the personal impact on us at the same time as having to respond to it from a company point of view. And I know, from my personal point of view, my sister-in-law, who lives in the US, contracted COVID about 4 or 5 weeks ago, and has been, I think she's okay, but because she's asthmatic, she's been sort of struggling with it for quite some time. My daughter, who works in hospitality, my oldest daughter, she lost her job in the first week of COVID arising, and my mother's, I've got elderly parents in the UK who are not very well, and that's difficult because you can't visit them. So and every one of us will have a similar sort of set of stories, and so I don't think it should be lost on all of us that it's having some sort of personal impact at the same time as we're having to respond as leaders. But look, from Telstra's perspective, as I said, we're pretty used to dealing with a crisis, and so our crisis management procedures are pretty well tried and tested. And so we had our crisis management team stood up pretty quickly. And as I said, we've been barely stood down from the bushfires, which has been a very big season for us, particularly in your neck of the woods, obviously before Christmas, and then further south in New South Wales, and then into Victoria and South Australia as we went into this December. So we've got a pretty tried and tested process for doing that, and we did stand that up pretty quickly. But as we'll come on to shortly as well, crisis management processes are good for dealing with issues in the moment because they're a quick and rapid way to make tactical decisions. But the more COVID went on, the more one realised that this was going to be a challenge and a crisis that was with us for a lot longer. And in fact, we needed to start to think about how we not only responded in the moment to those issues, but how we were thoughtful about the future. But maybe we'll come to that in a moment. But I do think having that tried and tested crisis management approach was helpful for us. The other thing that was also helpful for us, candidly, is we introduced something called All Roles Flex, which is the concept that every office role within Telstra has been eligible to work flexibly for at least the last 5 or 6 years. And we introduced that as part of our diversity and inclusion efforts over the last years. And as a consequence, even before we went into COVID, on average, our people would work 2 days a week from home anyway, and all from a location that wasn't their main office. And so we made a quick decision to move 25,000 people nearly 12 weeks ago now to work from home. And we did that on a Friday night, and then on Monday morning, everybody was working from home. But it was enabled by having had that sort of previous policy position in place.
Yeah, I did read the comments you made in relation to the crisis team being, already up and going, and it's one thing having them operate in an environment where they're relatively unconstrained, but what steps had to be taken to ensure both the safety and ongoing productivity of your workforce, given the challenges that they had, and what was involved in overcoming those to make sure that you could still get on with the job?
Yeah, I mean, look, there were really 3 areas of impact for us from COVID. First was workforce capacity, second was network, third was financial, and we can come on to the latter 2 in a second, but workforce capacity was definitely an important one. We have about 30,000 FTEs and about another 30,000 service contractors who work for Telstra globally. And so we have a lot of people that can work from home. We probably have close to globally in the order of 40 to 45,000 that are working from home globally across both FTEs and also service contractors. But then we have a number of roles that can't work from home. So field techs, will be a good example. People in the stores is another good example. Some of our call centres is another good example. And so we've been having to work through that workforce capacity dynamic, and it's not fully solutioned yet, because in places like the Philippines and India, where we've got people working offshore, even if we're able to work from home or they're able to work from home, there are various different privacy considerations that we need to take into account and manage, and security situations we need to take into account and manage, where we can't necessarily allow them to work from home, even if we could. And then, of course, for those that we do want to work from home, particularly call centre agents, as I mentioned, we have typically had this concept of all roles flex for our office people, but call centres, as people would appreciate, have large-scale technology supporting them. And just to put this in perspective, we had, going into this crisis, probably in our collective call centres, or rather in parts of our organisation where people were spending time on the phone, more than 25 to 30% of their time on the phone with an end customer, and many which are literally 90% on the time on their phone with an end customer, we would have somewhere in the order of 17,500 people. So it's one thing to sort of shift a call centre to home when you've got a couple of hundred people. When you've got 17,500 over 30 different locations in 5 different countries, it becomes slightly more complicated. And the technology that you need to set up in those homes to be able to enable that is pretty significant. So there's some of the challenges we've been dealing with. One of the interesting things is, as well, is whilst, and we may come on to this, the network actually has performed incredibly well. Where we found most, if you like, wrinkles or issues in people going to work from home, and actually probably more so for some of our enterprise customers, is in their applications environment, not necessarily in their network environment. Now, the issues could present themselves as network issues. So, in other words, if you are ordinarily got a business and everybody's logging on to the company's systems within the context of the office, within the firewalls of the office, that's one thing. But if they're all actually coming in from outside over the VPN, we were seeing a lot of customers that were having issues of avalanches on lots of people trying to log on at the same time, and the applications are not set up in that way. I think most of those wrinkles have been worked out by now, and I don't know about the people on this call, but I literally feel from looking where I'm looking, actually that aspect of COVID, the fact of people working remotely and working virtually, has been the piece that has gone remarkably well, and probably better than anyone could have hoped for or expected.
And that's a good point. I know we get reports from businesses up here in the region that there have been reports of issues where you might be making a phone call and you get a response on the thing to say that network is congested, which is different to the point you make. And I understand, if you're used to working remotely and you're logging on to work systems, before COVID it was clunky, and what you're saying is people now experiencing that for the first time, being around a software issue, it can still be clunky. As far as those network issues are concerned, though, has that been an issue where you've had to try and contemplate turning a very big ship that usually goes pretty slowly to respond to something that happened extremely quickly? And what sort of things did you have to put in place to be able to handle that?
Yeah, no, look, I mean, ironically, in the early days, I thought the network challenges were going to be the biggest issue we had to manage, and it's not. It's transpired to be the workforce capacity issues, which we knew would be a challenge. But I think, as I say, the constraints on working from home in overseas locations wasn't necessarily something we contemplated. And the other interesting thing about this crisis is that most of us have business continuity plans in place. One of the things that's inherent in those plans is diversifying aspects of our business, whether it's networks or our workforce. And of course, this is the one incident where a diversification of your workforce across multiple locations has not been helpful at all, because virtually every country, every country, every community, every city, every location is challenged with the same issue, which is not the same in a flood or a cyclone or some other type of isolated event. But the way to think about the network is that a telecommunications network is dimensioned and built a bit like a road network for the peak period of traffic. So, if you imagine a road, for the majority of the day, the road is actually running pretty freely, and and if anything, everyone can get around pretty well, particularly sort of arterial roads out to airports and things like that. And yet there's a moment in the day, what's called it sort of 7 o'clock or 8 o'clock in the morning or 5 o'clock in the afternoon, whatever it may be, rush hour, when the traffic peaks and then everything comes to a grinding halt. Think about the same dynamic for a network. We have to dimension for the peak period of traffic in the day. And so one of the things that happened with COVID is that, of course, all of the activity that we were previously conducting in our place of work or in our education institution during the course of the day, we suddenly pivoted and shifted all of that to home. But the good news is that wasn't the peak period of traffic. Ordinarily on our network at home, our peak period of traffic on our network at home is typically 7 to 9 o'clock in the evening, when the family comes home and they're streaming movies and things like that. And so that was one of the things that helped us. We did increase capacity by about 40%, and also bear in mind, network traffic had been increasing by 40 to 50% per annum pre-COVID. Now it increased 40 to 50% in a matter of weeks, but typically we deal with that increase in capacity every year. So it's not that we're not used to dealing with that. As I mentioned, there were pinch points, but they were actually more often than not nothing really to do with the network. There were things like, I remember in the early days, the government call centre information sites, particularly when they launched all of the welfare stimulus, they got completely smashed. And so everyone would dial in at 8 o'clock in the morning, and the network could cope with it. But what was actually happening is they didn't have enough operators to tackle all the calls, as you could imagine. The calls all then went into wait, and their call centre application crashed under the sort of the weight of all of those sort of holding calls. So people were bumped off the calls, which, as I say, manifested itself to them as a network issue. It actually wasn't a network issue. It was actually in the application of the call centre. The final one probably to mention as well is that where we have had to work and run pretty hard is building uplink. So ordinarily, for our personal use, whether it's a mobile phone or the fixed broadband in the home, you think about what we're doing, most people are downloading, so they're worried about the download speed. They're streaming movies, they're gaming, whatever it may be. Actually, when we're working and studying, we're doing a lot of upload. We might be uploading materials, presentations, video going both ways. And typically, networks have been dimensioned in this area for high capacity downloads, slightly lower capacity uploads. That's why you hear about NBN plans. You get the 50-20 plan or the 50-10 plan or the 100-20 plan. That's referring to 100 down, 20 up. And so we've seen big increases in uploads, which we've had to build capacity for.
Andy, I wonder if I could ask you what the pressing needs of business have been of your business customers through this crisis.
Yeah, Amy, look, I think they range across the nature and the type of the business, and I'm sure there'll be representatives right the way across the board here today. I mean, there are some businesses that clearly, their whole business model has been completely impacted as a consequence of the restrictions that have needed to be put in place. And then there are other businesses that are sort of in very, very significant demand. So the sorts of things that we've been dealing with are anything from how do we help our customers rapidly move to work from home? And that's actually helping them address some of those application and network pinch points that I've sort of mentioned. And then also sharing some of our experiences as how we configure and set up the various different technologies, whether it's, what are we using today, Zoom, I think, or WebEx or VMR or Skype or what all of those sorts of technologies. All the way through to helping some of our customers who candidly want to put their business in hibernation for the next 6 months because it's just the most efficient thing to do is to reduce costs, shut it down with the hope that as the economy recovers, they can restart their business and do that in such a way that they don't incur any shutdown costs or any sort of startup costs associated with it as well. So they've been some of the issues. And I think the other dimension is, I said in a sort of an interview the other day that, it feels as if we've made more progress in adopting digital, if you like, as a way of doing business and a way of living our lives, more so in the last 3 months than probably we would have done in 5 years. And what's interesting is that's because a lot of the technology is already there. I mean, there's obviously some areas where the technology isn't there, but in a lot of cases the technology is there, but either we've not adopted it because there's a bit of inertia in terms of our usage. Well, that's just been just given a big shot in the arm because we've all suddenly become experts in all of these various different digital technologies. And I think as we become experts in them or more used to them, actually we find that they're pretty efficient and pretty effective. And I find that most people, if they can help themselves digitally, they'd much rather do that than go through a call centre or an account executive. I mean, I think we're all sort of, so I think that's going to get a bit of a leap forward. And then also there's a whole bunch of areas where bureaucracy and red tape have got in the way, which has been, some quick decisions that have been made. For example, telemedicine, which is quite a big part of our health business, which in other words is having a medical consult over a video or a telephone rather than meeting a doctor or a GP in person. We've been struggling to get traction in that area for a number of years. Candidly, the single biggest reason is because you can't get a rebate from Medicare. If you go and see the doctor in the doctor's practice, you can get a rebate from Medicare. If you wanted to consult with the doctor over a video, you couldn't. And why was that? Well, because the doctors were largely resisting it because they were worried that it was going to cannibalise their business. So that decision, which we've been lobbying for 5 years, got made in 48 hours like that in the middle of COVID. Telemedicine has quadrupled in the last 3 weeks. And they're, I think, great examples of how things can move forward quickly.
Yeah, we'll speak a little bit about those lasting changes in a minute, because I know you have put an expansive piece on LinkedIn earlier this week in which you sort of looked at the key changes you see coming out of COVID. But I also wanted to ask you, as a CEO, having to balance sort of financial imperatives against, I guess, acting for the good of the community in an extreme situation. Telstra's had to extend many concessions, I guess, in these sort of times, like extending credit, giving away services like data that people would normally pay for, increasing customer service. As a CEO, do you push commercial considerations to the side at a time like this, or have you still got to have an eye to the balance sheet?
Yes, you do need to have an eye to the balance sheet, but it's interesting. Before COVID, really sort of we were aware of the significance of COVID around about the early part of February. I gave a speech in Melbourne around what responsible business meant in the 2020s. And I guess it was on reflection that by the end of 2019, arguably big business's reputation with communities in Australia and with its customers was probably at a lowest point. It's been for as long as I can remember in my career, particularly after the Royal Banking Commission. And I felt that it was at a time in the beginning of 2020 to really rethink about what was business and big business in particular's role in society and debunk the myth, if you like, or not so much the myth, but the theory that's been around for many years, sort of through Milton Friedman and that whole thought that, the only role of business is to maximise value for shareholders, and actually say, no, business does play a broader role in the community and in the society in which it operates. And in fact, you'll never maximise value for shareholders unless you recognise that and take on that role. Because, big business, particularly businesses that provide, broadly speaking, an essential service, which we do, you can't think about only the immediate commercial returns in that regard. And so one of the things that we did quite quickly was to be thoughtful about how do we support our people, by giving them certainty around jobs, how do we support our customers, and how do we support the broader economy and the role that we can play as the government was coming up with that early sort of round of stimulus, and that led to us sort of saying, well, we're going through a transformation, we're going through a lot of change like everybody else is. We were reducing our headcount. We still need to do that, but we're going to pause for 6 months to give our people certainty. For our casual workers, we're going to guarantee that they're going to get sick pay and holiday pay, because they wouldn't ordinarily for the people that who are working in our stores who may need to go home. For our customers, suspend disconnection notices, allow customers to put their businesses in hibernation, increase data allowances, particularly for those in hardship, and then for the economy, accelerating our already sort of short payment schedule for small, medium business and supplier payments, and then as well as bringing forward capital expenditure, because I just think that there is that expectation and role that we need to play. Now, at the same time, we need to ensure our financial sustainability and strength for the future. So you've got to be considered in undertaking those types of initiatives. But we very much came to it from the perspective of what can we do, what's sensible to do, where can we have the biggest impact on our customers and on our people as well. And it was interesting, one of the things, because we'd also done that on the back of the bushfires as well, where we'd made we paid their mobile phone bills basically for a couple of months for any of the firefighters or emergency services respondents. And so it's something that I think is quite ingrained in Telstra, but I think is part of corporate social responsibility and part of the role of big business today.
In drawing, that future looking that you've alluded to, as well as your comments about the telehealth, and that's amazing. Given that I remember when they first started sprouting NBN, that was going to be one of the first things that we were to jump on, but it didn't really happen. But looking ahead, the telecommunications picture, well, to me, would seem to be something that's morphing, that is changing, and just interested in what your thoughts are on that, and whether there are other such impediments that are in place. And I imagine the 5G network, for example, is going to be a lot easier to expand than what doing cables and other things were in the past. But they all come at a cost. So what are the trends that you're looking at, or you think are going to emerge from this that you'll need to respond to, and how will you handle it?
Yeah, no, thanks, Bob. Well, I mean, a couple of thoughts. I mean, firstly, one of the things that I observe is that in COVID, and credit to the government and to other policymakers, is that they have made some significant decisions very quickly. Decisions around issues such as I mentioned on health that would have taken years and never get made. And we've managed to cut through and make those decisions quickly. And they're bold decisions which take us further forward, in significant steps. And so I think that's one of the big learnings for COVID, and how do we inculcate that into the culture moving forward? I did a thing on that earlier this week, and I identified 5 areas where let's use this as an opportunity to double down and really take bold steps in a number of areas, on areas where our progress to date has been too slow, too incremental. I called out, progressing to a digital economy, telecommunications, policy, diversity, climate, as examples. That cybersecurity would be another one. But on telecommunications in particular, we're at an important inflection. Telecommunications was always important anyway, because it's the platform for the digital economy, and we've just been demonstrating how important that is, and it's only going to be more important in the future. Secondly, it's important because, as you say, we're on the cusp of 5G. We're also on the cusp of the finish of the rollout of the NBN. We're also on the cusp of new technologies such as cloud and edge compute and artificial intelligence. And so now is a brilliant opportunity to think very strategically about the future of the telecommunications sector for the whole of Australia, not just Telstra or NBN or Optus, whoever it may be, but for Australia. And I think that there's a number of things in that regard. So how do we support the rapid acceleration and rollout of 5G, particularly in an environment where now 1 in 10 Australians think that 5G is the cause of COVID, which is the most ridiculous thing ever, but there's a lot of scaremongering going on. Also, with the NBN now being rolled out, the thing about a telecommunications network is that it's not like many other forms of infrastructure where you build them and then you put your shovel down and then you sort of run them for the next 20 years. a telecommunications network needs constant upgrading, technology, new technology coming through. Even since the rollout, or rather the policy decision to commence the rollout of NBN on mobile, we've gone from 3G to 4G to 5G. And 5G is 100 times faster with 100 times more capacity than 3G. That's the sort of roadmap we need for the technology future for the NBN. Another really important area is regional and rural and remote Australia. That's always been sort of, it's a tougher solution, sorry, it's a tougher environment to solve from a telecommunications perspective, but you know, there's too many different overlapping policies. There's the USO, there's NBN, there's the Regional Advisory Council on Telecom, and there's the Mobile Black Spots program. Now is a great opportunity to bring all these initiatives together in a more holistic, integrated strategic approach and better allocate, you know, quite a lot of money, which is already being spent, to come up with better solutions for regional and remote Australia.
Andy, just getting back to that, the article you wrote earlier this week, which we mentioned earlier, you outlined in that 5 areas, I guess, of opportunity that you've seen that have arisen from this crisis. We've touched on a couple of them, digitisation being one. Would you like to give us a bit of an overview of what your thoughts are in that area?
Well, I think, as I say, there's a couple of things. I mean, one is that there's been a very significant adoption of digital by users. So I think that's a great sort of starting point. I think lots of small businesses have had to pivot their model to digital very, very quickly to survive the current sort of period in the current environment. And small medium business in Australia is probably the least digitally enabled of, you know, all business. And so I've been working with the BCA and with organisations such as MYOB, which obviously provides accounting, you know, Microsoft and Google and others. How do we accelerate digital solutions for small medium business? I think that's a critically important area. And then I think there's just a whole raft of regulatory, what I'd call micro regulatory reform. Yes, there's always the big sort of picture strategic stuff, but just go through every piece of legislation or regulation that requires a paper sort of solution, whether it's a receipt or a point of evidence or a certificate. And there are myriads of them at federal level, at state level, at local sort of county level, and just replace it all with electronic. And I just think a systematic review, if you went to lots and lots and lots of businesses and asked them sort of where are the inefficiencies in your business that you could eliminate them in the sense that technology exists, but just the local council requires you to put in a paper submission, or somebody requires you to have a physical certificate for something, or there's some form of legislation that gets in the way of an electronic solution. You know, what more can we do to move towards a cashless society is another good example. So I just think a whole bunch of reform at a micro level, if we could push through, that would really accelerate the digital economy as a good example. The other part of it as well that I've talked about in my chair, the government's advisory board on cybersecurity, is we are now, and of course the more digital we become, the more exposed we become from a cybersecurity perspective, and we are now in a more cyber vulnerable environment because we're now sort of operating in a much more distributed way over VPNs. Cybersecurity takes on another very significant dimension. So I've been working with the government on this, and they will be shortly announcing their 2020 cybersecurity strategy. So that's another area where we need to take some bold steps forward.
You've touched on a number of issues there, and you know the cybersecurity one is going to be a huge one for the country if we're anything to believe that what a lot of the experts are telling us. And Wayne Dean has touched on an issue in relation to competition in the market, which can be a strength or a weakness depending on what investment is required moving forward. We've also seen in the media just lately that Telstra's been, you know, linked with the possibility of either maybe taking over might be too strong term, Andy, but cuddling up closer with the NBN. Are all these things going to show promise for us? In other words, like the way the telecommunication industry is heading, we've got the right players in place, and we're well positioned to look after these things that we've got for the future? Or do you believe there's still some significant reforms and changes that might be needed to get us on the right footing?
I think there are some significant reforms and changes that are needed. So, for example, I mentioned the USO and how the last 8% is provided service, because at the moment, from a broadband perspective, you've got NBN providing fixed wireless and satellite solutions, and the government funds that, and then we provide a basic telephony service through copper services and radio CAN services and some satellite services for voice, and we basically, there's a contract that the government sort of funds us to help provide that. And then there's the mobile black spots program that I mentioned, so the government's partially funding that and we're funding that as well. And so there's quite a few, just literally on regional and rural, there's quite a few sort of overlapping and areas that are trying to solve for it. And one of the issues with it is that it's sort of technology driven. So in other words, the solution is technology specific, whereas in fact my guess is most of your members and people living in regional or rural Australia, they don't really care actually how they get connected. They don't care what technology is, they just want it to work. So there are some constraints to going forward because of the way and the history in which it's been developed, is just as an example. And I do think, as my point that I mentioned earlier on the NBN, I think all of the energy and understandably and focus on the NBN to date has been on completing the build and rolling it out. Yes, but okay, so how do we equivalently go from NBN 3, as we have in mobile, from 3G to 4G to 5G? How do we go from NBN generation 1 to 2 to 3 to 4 to 5? That's the roadmap and the path that we need for the future. And so I think there is quite a lot of work and reform that's required in that regard. My point is, if ever there were a moment in time to be ambitious and to be bold around what that is, now is the moment. And of course, often a lot of these decisions get held back because people are sort of, if you feel like they're felt as if they're bound by the shackles of the past, previous political commitments or previous sort of decisions that have been made, whether it's corporate or in real-time politics, or, dare I say, writing down values of things. And I'm not saying I'd get into trouble if I say write down the value of the NBN. I think it's completely irrelevant. My point is, set up the future for the NBN and for the industry. If that results in some form of write down, who cares? I mean, in the context of the government spending a $320 billion fiscal stimulus to help the economy through this period, now is the moment to just get rid of all the silly little constraints that people have felt and that have held them back, and sort of, sweep through with bold decisions.
Well, I think one of the resistance to change, as you say, in the past is one thing, but the other thing that governments have always blockage is being the resistance to put their hands in their pocket, where good ideas are going to seem to cost them money. But what you've outlined there would seem to be an opportunity, and in this current environment that we've got, one that we should take with both hands. And is it one that would cost government significant amounts of money, or is it really just allowing the operators like Telstra and NBN Co and everybody else getting on with the job?
Well, I mean, it's going to cost money to upgrade the NBN. I mean, but that's what we do every day of the week in our networks. It's going to cost money. But it's how you set up the right structure with the right incentives to make that happen. And of course, the flip side of that is the benefit is it then supports the acceleration of the digital economy, which actually drives productivity and growth, which is actually the biggest single lever that you can pull. So yes, it's an infrastructural investment, but it's a necessary infrastructural investment. And if we don't make it, then in fact what we're going to do is hold back the opportunity to drive more productivity and growth in the future.
Let's hope so.
Yeah.
we've come to the end of the time. Is there anything else, Amy, that we've got to wrap on, or otherwise
No, I think we're out of questions. But...
All right. Well, Andy, look, it's been very valuable listening to you this morning. It's and very insightful, and to hear from someone who's really at the pointy end of some of these discussions that are going on in government at the moment, that really are going to be very, very important in guiding us now to this recovery stage that we're all talking about. And we all know that your industry is going to play a particular and very important role in that. So once again, on behalf of everybody here, thank you very much for your time this morning and today. And look, I hope to welcome you back to Newcastle in person at some other time. As you say, you are a frequent visitor here in context of your role and your position. So we thank you for that. And we know the important role that the Telstra play in the telecommunications networks right across our region. So thank you very much for being with us today. And thanks to Clayton and the team for helping us organise it. I'd also like a final thanks to the Newcastle Permanent for their support for this series, and thank you them for being with us today. Before I go, before we sign off, just a couple of reminders for future events. On the 3rd of June, Tanya Constable, who is the CEO of the Minerals Council of Australia, is joining us, so that'll be a good one. And then on Wednesday the 10th of June at 2 p.m, we'll have a regional leaders panel. Also, just a quick reminder, we have got a session this Friday that's been put on rather quickly. Kyle Scott from Adler is going to respond to issues that have come out of the WorkPack case that was handed down last week. We've already got a strong response to that webinar on Friday. If you can join us, you are interested, please do so. Thank you again, everyone, for being with us today. To Amy and Jack and the team, and to Andy and Telstra and everybody else. And thank you, and have a great day.